Hello, BookTube. We have only a week left in the month of September. That means October is right around the corner, and that means a few BookTube events. There are quite a few BookTube events in October. There are a couple on this channel alone. but one of the big ones is Victober, which I made a video a little bit ago when the announcement was made of the reading challenges for Victober 2018. Katie at Books and Things and a bunch of other great booktubers are doing a month-long celebration of all things Victorian, and of course I'm along for the ride because I have made no secret of the fact that I consider the Victorian era to be the greatest explosion of human creativity in the history of the species. I don't think that it has an equal and only barely a little competition from something like the Quattrocento or 5th century Athens. I think the Victorian era carries it away. The combination of drastically broadened base for literature, for schooling, basic schooling, and the explosion of the printing press and the explosion of railway lines that allowed for the incredible dissemination of literature just in England alone. I think something was in the air. Not to mention the fact the accession to the throne of a very modest and very young woman after just a long period in which the psychic weather vane of the nation, the monarchy, was pointing straight down to the depths of hell. So I think all of those things sort of combined together to make for an outburst of inquiry and inventiveness and imagination that I don't know the like. So I love Victober. And I've been watching the Victober reading videos, the TBR videos as they've been popping up recently. Watching a little bit bittersweet, since almost everybody that's making a video is talking very enthusiastically about all the buddy reads that they'll be doing during the month of October as part of Victober. But I'm not part of any buddy reads in Victober. Nobody wants to buddy read with me because they hate me, because I smell. But it certainly looks like the rest of you are having fun. But anyway, I wanted to go over my own TBR. This is the questions were all cooked up by the hosts of Victober 2018. That is Katie at Books and Things, Lucy at Lucy the Reader, Ange at Beyond the Pages, and Kate Howe, who've come up with these challenges to help you structure your Victober, and they're really a lot of fun. I was, I don't know, kind of vaguely put off at the beginning when I read them, but then the more I thought about them last night, the more I thought, no, these are really good. These are general and playful. They are, in fact, what reading challenges for read-alongs or whatnot should be. They are general enough so that you can play around to your heart's content. I love that. So the first one is read a book by one of the hosts' favorite authors. Each one of these hosts has made no secret of the fact that they have a particular favorite Victorian author. And I'm going to go with Katie from Books and Things. I'm going to go with Charles Dickens, who's a Victorian author. He's the most famous Victorian author of them all, and he's never been a favorite of mine. I've never really enjoyed his novels. Seem so much to me like mugging. They seem like you're reading and right next to you, right at your elbow, is the author himself going, huh? I never lose that sensation in any of his novels. They all seem so incredibly commercial that I know that seems strange for me to say, considering that I love Anthony Trollope, but I think Trollope gets lost in his stories. And when an author gets lost in their own stories, they stop being explicitly commercial. If that never happens, then it's all, huh? What about that, But anyway, riding into the rescue here is the fact that Charles Dickens wrote a ton of nonfiction, where it's okay for you to be mugging for the camera, especially in the case of paid-by-the-line travel writing, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do American Notes, which is from 1842. That's his I haven't read it in forever. I think I have a Penguin Classic of it, and it's his book of dispatches from America, where he goes all over the country and comes up with all sorts of acidic and funny commentary on all parts of society. This in this book where he says that he's never heard any language anywhere in the world fouler than that which he heard on the lips of a girl in Lowell, Massachusetts. And this is also the basis for the famous episode of the great television show Bonanza, where Charles Dickens makes an appearance. So I'm going to read American Notes. I haven't read American Notes in a long time, so I will do that. Then prompt number 2 is read a Victorian book with a name or proper noun in the title. And as I mentioned in my earlier video, that was something of a fad, so it still is. So it's not hard to do. In fact, Barter Hordes and a couple of other people have pointed out that it is fairly easily possible to meet all of these 5 reading prompts with one book. It's not terrifically hard to do. But the one that I'm going to pick for this one is the Weir of Hermiston. This is Weir of Hermiston is the name of a person, the name of a character in this book. This is by Robert Louis Stevenson. It is from 1896, so creeping on towards the end of the Victorian era, and it's Stevenson's unfinished book. It's he was literally writing it the day he died. He was working on it industriously. He was rail thin. People who would go to meet him, meet the famous author of Treasure Island or whatnot, would be utterly appalled by what they saw. They tried to be courteous about it, especially when they were at his dinner table, but they didn't believe, most of them didn't believe, that any human being could be that thin and still be alive. And it is common in Robert Louis Stevenson biographies, including one by Frank McGlynn that I absolutely love. It's common to talk about his consumption. He had consumption, and it was really bad. He had a really bad case. He was blowing aneurysms all the time in his lungs and his legs. And those biographers and most of the knee-jerk stuff about Robert Louis Stevenson also, when they're talking about that, because that has a nice piquant aura of romance to it, they leave out the fact that he was an unbelievable, overwhelming tobacco addict, and that he would have been coughing up a lung and dying anyway. But one way or another, even though he was a wreck physically, where imagine the life that he and a bunch of other Victorians led, where no deep breaths, you never take a deep breath, and where if you risk it, if you're out for a long walk and it's a brisk, beautiful fall day, and you remember what it was like to be healthy when you were younger, and you decide to take a deep breath and you cough, you don't know if, oh, well, I'm just out of shape, or if you're going to be coughing for the next 3 days. And maybe at the end of that 3 days, you cough until you die. It's under such circumstances, plenty of people would have stopped working completely, and Stevenson never did. Except when he was physically incapacitated, he never did. So he was writing this book on the day that he died, but he didn't finish it. And I haven't read, Penguin came out with a classic of it. I haven't read the part that he wrote in quite some time. So that's going to be my proper name in the title. And then number 3 is read a book from the beginning of the Victorian era. That's 1937 to 1947, or the end of the Victorian era, 1891 to 1901, or both. Classic bookworm type thing. And I'm going to read both. And for the first part, I've praised Project Gutenberg on this channel a million times. A gigantic book database, all in open source formatting, so that if you like reading on an e-reader, Project Gutenberg has more books than you could read in a lifetime, of all kinds of varieties. You go to many classic free ebook sites and you'll get the same 1,000 books, Moby Dick, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, that sort of thing. But Project Gutenberg has everything. And not only that, but you're not at the whim of some $8 an hour graduate student photocopying stuff in the back room of a library. These are curated, beautifully presented electronic texts that are free. And there's a wealth of Victorian era literature on Project Gutenberg. But nevertheless, the one that I want to do for the beginning of the Victorian era, I couldn't find on Project Gutenberg. They might not have this author. The author is Catherine Gore, and she was absolutely prolific. And the book that I want to choose, I think it's from, I don't know if I jotted it down here. I think it's from 1841, and it's Cecil, her novel Cecil, which is the adventures of a highborn coxcomb, a highborn wastrel. Imagine Bertie Wooster only aggressive. And the novel, Cecil, is just endless. I remember it. I read it a long time ago, but I remember it as being just endlessly enjoyable. Including starting off with, it's all narrated by Cecil himself, who starts off, Oliver Twist style with his birth. And talks about how he first became a self-infatuated coxcomb by when he was a tiny little red-faced baby, and he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the mirror. That was the only thing that made him happy. It was like a little glimpse into Adam's life in Memento Mori. But surely that's what little Adam was like when he was a baby. Totally fractious and yelling all the time, unless he happened to catch a glimpse of himself in the mirror, and then he was just fine. But before we get Cecil narrating his infancy and childhood, we get a preface that is sheer genius, where he addresses the critics. He addresses book critics and mocks them. And says, no one ever pays any attention to you anyway. You no more direct the public taste than a railway car directs the engine that pushes it. You don't have any say one way or another. There's a great line. I don't have it with me here because I don't have the iPad here in the room. But there's a great line where in that preface where Cecil just roundly says that no author was ever written down except by his publisher, who wrote down a figure on a check, and no author was ever written up except that way. The only important way for an author to be written up is by the publisher writing a check, and that the only way for an author to be written down is by himself. The critics are utterly useless, which, if you think about it, is genius, because no critic is going to be able to ignore that. And if you get them angry or nodding in sympathy, they'll notice your book. But then the story goes on from there. It's just one misadventure of this entitled fop. One misadventure after another. So that's the one I'm going to choose from the beginning of the reign. That is Cecil by Catherine Gore. And then from the end of the reign, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do 1901, the very end of the Victorian era, Kim by Rudyard Kipling, which won him critical acclaim. I know I often complain on this channel that Kipling is largely gone. He's largely been eluded out of the Western canon and literary discussion, because he's viewed as this imperialism bugaboo, this colonial booster, so that his political views aren't right, so we mustn't study his literature. And of course, you can guess what I think about that. And this is an intensely political book, but even so, I love Kipling. I love virtually everything that he wrote. So, and I haven't read Kim. I didn't check ahead of time. Long time ago, Modern Library did a list of it was clickbait, but it was clickbait before the internet. They did a list of the best novels and works of nonfiction of the 20th century. And they had custom-made bookmarks, and they put stickers on all the novels from the list that they publish, and they brought in a bunch of experts, and it was a grand discussion. It was a lot of fun. It was also a fun occasion for me to see all the bookish people that I knew at the time pretend that they had read Zuleika Dobson. but Kim was on that list, and I reread Kim because it was on that list. But that has to be going on 30 years ago, so it's high time that I read it again. So I'm going to do both. Those are my bookend picks for this prompt, which is the beginning and the end of the Victorian era. Although I myself, not for the purposes of Victober, I myself think when you're thinking historically, that it's better to think of the long Victorian era than just the strict reign of Victoria. Or if you're going to say that it's the strict reign of Victoria, then make it a short Victorian era. Because none of the books, Victoria came to the throne in the late 1830s, and the books that came out in those first few years were definitely products of the Georgian era. They had nothing to do with her. But one way or another, for the purposes of Victober, that's prompt number 3. Then prompt number 4 is read a Victorian book written by a woman anonymously or under a pen name. And I'm going to use Cecil again for this book, because Catherine Gore wrote it anonymously. And it was famously the talk of London for a while, days, weeks, where everyone in the literary world in London was wondering who wrote this book. And all sorts of literary names were put forward as to, who could this be? Who could have done this? You had all sorts of the leading book experts and critics of the day analyzing the prose and saying, oh, well, it has to be so-and-so. Oh, well, it's indisputably so-and-so. The finger of suspicion fell on Thackeray for a while. And he was very funny about it, saying that considering that that if I walk into a bookstore, my own fledgling attempts are sitting there unmolested, whereas there's a line of people waiting to buy Cecil. I would love it if I were the author. She wrote it anonymously, and she wrote it anonymously for a reason that we have talked about just recently on this channel with Kenneth Galbraith. She wrote it because she had already written a shelf of books and established a literary name for herself. She never stopped writing, and she is Catherine Gore is one of those there are very many more of them than we think. She's one of those figures in literary history, especially in the Victorian era, of women who just, their lives fell apart, their husbands died, their finances faltered, and they looked around and just thought, well, if I write ceaselessly, and if I pay attention to what the public likes to read and give it to them, I might be able to rescue my finances and support my family. And she did that for her whole life. And there's never been a biography of her. Her books are entirely out of print. They're not remembered, even though they're utterly delightful. And she's not the only one. There were many, many female writers who did that. And I think that's fascinating. But one way or another, I'm going to use her book, Cecil, or maybe I'll read the sequel. Cecil had, I think, a couple of sequels, but there's one, Cecil, a peer, if you're sensing that there's a verbal pun in the title, you're entirely right, but what a lot of good Catherine Gore's cleverness does now, in 2018, no one knows who she is. But one way or another, I might read just Cecil for these two to keep my Victober reading down to a presentable level, because I have a huge number of other things to do in October. And the people who pointed out that you can satisfy many of these challenges with the same book are entirely right. And then the last challenge is read a Victorian book and watch a screen adaptation of it. And I'm a little wary about doing this, to tell you the truth, because I loved the BBC adaptation of Daniel Deronda when it first appeared. I absolutely loved it. I doted on every episode, and then I got the DVD and I watched it over and over again back when I had a DVD player. And then years passed, and I got rid of all my DVDs, and I got rid of my TV, and I got rid of all that. And then it just so happened that I was able to see that adaptation again, and it didn't particularly hold up. That was horrifying. So I'm a little wary about maybe hauling out something else that I really liked, some adaptation that I really liked. Fortunately, technically, it's not English literature, but technically I have a solution. And that is Claire Niederprum's adaptation of Little Women. I have a screener for it here, and I haven't read it. I haven't looked at it yet. And I've been meaning to reread Little Women all year long, since I read, there was a new book about Little Women, about the book, about its reception, about its history, that I loved, thought was absolutely fantastic. And I've been meaning to reread Little Women since then. And I just haven't got around to it, mainly because there's one particular version of Little Women that I want to read, and I don't have it, and I haven't found it at the Brattle. It's an annotated edition, with a big white annotated edition that's the one I want. But I can certainly read it in between now and then. So I'm going to reread Little Women because of that nonfiction book, and I'm going to watch Claire Niederprum. I've never heard of this woman before. I'm going to watch her adaptation of Little Women on a screener, and that'll be because no one's ever going to film Cecil, unfortunately. So that's it. That is my Victober TBR, which I will be pursuing in smelly solitude, since nobody wants to do a buddy read with me. I did a couple of buddy reads in the month of September, and they seem to go well. You would expect that in a buddy read with yours truly, I would be leaving 20 messages a day. They'd be 20 minutes long each, but I controlled myself. You would think that in a buddy read with yours truly, I would be finishing the book immediately and then saying, oh, come on, hurry up. Oh, come on, hurry up. Oh, come on, hurry up. And I didn't do that either. I behaved myself. And yet, October's rolling around. Everybody's having fun with buddy reads except me, because I have webbed feet. But anyway, Victober will be fun anyway. All by myself. So I'll wrap this up for now, but I want you all to join. I want to end this video by urging you all, there's still plenty of time for you to work out a TBR. And like I mentioned, if you're worried about this taking too much of your time, well, two things. One, it's possible to fulfill a lot of these challenges using the same book. I could have used Cecil by Catherine Gore for the one about having a name in the title, for instance. And also, too, if you do that and you get it down to 3 books, maybe 2 or 3 books, the time spent will be well worth it for how much fun the event is. So that's the whole point of BookTube, right? Is that we're all in this for the community, for the fun. And this is a great BookTube event. So it's right around the corner. You have time to make a TBR, pull down the books, and get to work. So I urge you to do that. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. I'll see you soon, though. Thank you, BookTube.